In today's video, we're talking about the German Revolution Part 2. However, that title is slightly incorrect, as it really should be the following: The German Revolution Part 2, Political Power Struggles After the Abdication of the Kaiser, How Germans Reacted to the Treaty of Versailles, and the Aftermath of the Treaty. But that's kind of long, so we'll keep it short. The German Revolution Part 2. There are 4 essential questions that you should be able to answer by the end of this video. The first, what were the main political parties during the Weimar Republic? Second, what happened during the Spartacist Rising in January 1919? Third, how did Germans react to the Treaty of Versailles? And fourth, how did the Treaty of Versailles lead to the Kapp Putsch? The most important point of this whole video is that from 1918 to 1923, Germany faced a period of extreme political instability and violence, and we're going to be looking at examples of that. So I've organized today into a timeline. These dates are pretty standard. You already know many of them. It's important to remember that after the Kaiser abdicated, the Social Democrats, led by Friedrich Ebert, were in power. But let's look more closely into the main political parties in Weimar Germany. Remember talking about the political spectrum? Well, I want to review that a little bit before we go on. So on the left of the political spectrum, we have people who in general want to change society rapidly. They want to treat everybody as equals and give political power to workers. They're not keen on capitalism, and they want to abolish private ownership of land or businesses. Also, they're internationalists because they stress the cooperation of countries. Socialists and communists are left-wing parties. On the right wing, you find people who generally want to keep society very stable. They want a strong government dominated by powerful leaders. They like capitalism, which is the private ownership of land and business. They stress the importance of traditional values, families, law and order. And they're nationalist, meaning they place the interest of the nation over that of individuals. Fascists and Nazis are examples of right-wing parties. From 1918 until 1923, the German people were unhappy about a few things. They're unhappy about Germany's defeat in World War I. They're unhappy about the Treaty of Versailles. And there were a lot of economic problems in Germany, which we will look at in our next video. And this is why the German people were upset. And because people were unhappy, they were more supportive of more extreme left-wing and right-wing political groups between 1918 and 1923. Here you can see a political spectrum consisting of 7 different political parties in Germany during the Weimar Republic. I'm only going to focus on 3 of them. To the left, we have the KPD, which is the Communist Party. They were extremely left-wing and opposed to the Weimar Republic. Workers and some of the middle classes supported them. For these people, getting rid of the Kaiser was just the beginning of the revolution. Now they wanted a real social revolution like what had happened in Russia in 1917. An important thing to note for the future is that one of the main groups within the KPD was called the Spartacist League, which we will be looking at in our next event. So next, we have the Social Democrats. They were a little bit less left-wing than the Communists. They thought that getting rid of the Kaiser should be the end of the revolution. They didn't want Germany to change that much. And for some Social Democrats, even getting rid of the Kaiser was too much. They wanted to keep the monarchy. They used a lot of communist words like comrade, but they were actually very moderate. And they didn't want a communist-style revolution because they were afraid of losing the support of the rich elite. Also, remember that the Social Democrats, the SPD, were led at this time by Friedrich Ebert, and they were the people who were leading the German government. Now we will move on to the middle of the spectrum. Here you have the Democratic Party and Center Party. These were people who were very moderate and didn't want much change. And then, moving on to the right wing, there was the People's Party, the National Party, and the Nazi Party. At this time, the right wing included a whole bunch of small nationalist parties. These people hated the Weimar Republic as well as communism. They wanted to boost the power of the army, reinstate the Kaiser, reverse the Treaty of Versailles, and they had the support of the military, the judiciary, so that's like judges, and the civil service. They didn't want to give power to the ordinary people in the new democratic Weimar Republic. So what made this situation quite bad was that all of these political parties had their own private armies, which they recruited from ex-soldiers who were unemployed and angry about the government. So it was quite a violent time. One of these violent episodes was called the Spartacist Uprising. So, if you remember, I just said that the Spartacist League was the main revolutionary group of the KPD, and throughout December 1918, there were quite frequent clashes between the government and these revolutionaries. In January of 1919, Spartacist members staged an attempted revolution in Berlin against Friedrich Ebert's government. On the night of January 5, 1919, the Spartacists captured the headquarters of the government's newspaper and the telegraph bureau. But they didn't capture any other buildings, and really, they were not very well organized, and there wasn't much chance of success. In fact, the Freikorps easily crushed the uprising. Friedrich Ebert used the Freikorps because he couldn't rely upon the army, because the army didn't really support the new social democratic government. Remember that the Freikorps were basically soldiers who'd returned to Germany, and they weren't part of the army anymore. They were demobilized soldiers who had refused to give back their arms. So they were basically armed groups of men running around Germany and stirring up trouble. And Friedrich Ebert used these men to stop the uprising because the Freikorps hated the communists. And on January 10th, they took over Spartacist headquarters, and by January 15th, the Spartacists were basically crushed. About 100 Spartacists were killed compared to only 13 Freikorps members. It's clear that this was a very violent uprising that ultimately resulted in the success of the government, but they weren't strong enough to do this by themselves. They had to use the Freikorps to help them. This just underlines the fact that Weimar Germany was politically unstable, and the social democratic government wasn't very strong. The next event we will look at is the general election that occurs 4 days later on January 19th. In this election, the Social Democrats became the largest party, and Friedrich Ebert became the first president of the new Weimar Republic. As a side note, you might be wondering why we call this new era in German history the Weimar Republic. The capital of Germany was, and is today, Berlin, but because there was so much violent political unrest happening in Berlin during 1918 and 1919, the government moved to the town of Weimar, which is in the south. Weimar was a lot calmer and safer for the government. Later that year, in June of 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed, and Germans were hoping that it wouldn't be too harsh. They knew that they would have to pay for what had happened, but they hoped it wasn't going to be very harsh because the Kaiser had gone and they had a new democratic government. Furthermore, President Wilson of the USA also wanted a fair treaty, and Germans felt that they weren't really to blame for the whole war. However, the treaty that they got was very dictatorial and strict, and they had to sign it. Germans hated this treaty. They asked for several changes, but all were refused. Germans called the treaty the Diktat, meaning that it was dictated to them. They were not invited to the negotiations. They were just told what the terms were. So the treaty, they felt, had been dictated to them. And, as a result, it was very unpopular with Germans. In fact, the treaty was particularly difficult to take for many people because they believed that their army had never been defeated in the war. It had failed to win the war, but it hadn't been defeated. Critics of the treaty claimed that the army had been ready to fight on. The army would have continued if the government had supported them. And they felt that the government, particularly the politicians in Berlin, had betrayed the army. So, in effect, they felt as if the army had been stabbed in the back by the politicians in Berlin. And they called this Dolchstoß, or stabbed in the back. So people were angry, and the conservatives called the politicians who had signed the treaty the November criminals. The Treaty of Versailles caused a lot of resentment, greatly weakened the new government, and became a symbol of Germany's humiliation and defeat. Here is a little political cartoon from the time. I'd like you to jot a few of your observations and what you think the cartoon is showing in your notebook. So the treaty, and people being unhappy about the treaty, led to the Kapp Putsch, which happened in March of 1920. As we know, from the start, many Germans resented the treaty, and their resentment posed a huge threat to the stability of the Weimar Republic. Of all the groups in Germany who were unhappy with the treaty, the army was the most important. It hated the restrictions that were being placed upon it, and it blamed the government, the social democratic government, for having agreed to them. The German army was restricted to 10,000 men, no air force, and 6 ships. Yet although the army was reduced, many of the demobilized soldiers simply joined the Freikorps. We talked about them earlier in the video. They were those groups of men returning to Germany who were unhappy and angry with the government. So, in early 1920, the Allies like Britain, France, and the USA were getting worried about the size of the Freikorps, and they began to put pressure on Germany to disband them. And in March 1920, the German government was trying to disband the Freikorps. However, about 5,000 right-wing Freikorps, under the direction of a man by the name of Dr. Wolfgang Kapp, marched to Berlin and declared a new national government. And what was particularly troublesome was that the army didn't stop them. The Social Democratic government didn't have the support of the army. So what was Ebert's government to do? They had returned to Berlin, but then had to flee to Dresden when the Kapp Putsch took place. And when they realized that the army was not going to help them, they turned to the workers and asked them to hold a general strike. Many workers obliged because they had socialist leanings and they didn't want to see right-wing politicians get into power. So there was no gas, electricity, water, or transportation, and basically all of Berlin ground to a halt. As a result, Kapp couldn't continue his putsch because he couldn't govern. Therefore, the putsch collapsed within days. It's important to note that the people who were involved in the Kapp Putsch were never punished because without the support of the army, Friedrich Ebert's government couldn't do anything about them. Although we won't be looking into any further examples, it actually wasn't until the end of 1923 that political unrest in Weimar Germany calmed down. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.